All right, well today we're going to be talking about normalcy, the United States in the 1920s, and in particular the first novel of F. Scott Fitzgerald, which is called This Side of Paradise. He wrote the first parts of it when he was a student at Princeton. It was published in 1920. It was something that immediately took the literary world by storm. It sold out its first printing and went into several additional printings almost immediately, got great reviews, made him famous overnight. Now, first of all, let's think about the end of the First World War. You would think that the end of the war would be a terrific and happy time. Not true. In the last months of the war, there was an epidemic of Spanish flu. It began in a few places in the world. One of the first places it was identified was in Spain, hence the name Spanish flu. But it ended up sweeping around large parts of the world and doing devastation. Some people have said that the German army actually was forced to surrender and that World War I ended because so many German troops caught the flu. Here you see beds in the United States of soldiers who came down sick with the flu. It affected millions of people. Between January 1918, so a few months before the end of the war, and then December of 1920, there were 20 to 50 million dead across the world as a result of this flu. Now, that's not as bad as the Black Plague in Europe, which at some points killed off about a third of Europe's population. This was about 3% of the world's population. But in areas that were affected, it was remarkably powerful. In the United States Army, there was one particular base where it first appeared. Only 2 people from that entire base survived. Okay, so it was extraordinarily powerful. Most people did not have much immunity to it. It swept very, very rapidly. By the time you realized anybody in the group was sick, it had already spread to most of the people in the group. It was absolutely devastating, especially in large cities where people could easily transmit the flu virus one to another. And so it was remarkably devastating. If you think 3% of the world's population, but probably 2/3 of the world's population wasn't in an area that was particularly affected, then you can get some idea of the extent of the damage. Although it did not originate in the United States, it spread very rapidly in the United States because of returning troops coming back from Europe. They were in some cases affected, and then they affected the American population. So, especially in areas with military bases, it became a terrible devastation. There were other forms of turmoil that swept through the country and really much of the world in 1919. In January of 1919, Prohibition, which had been passed under the Wilson administration as part of the progressive movement's attempt to clean up America, it took effect in January. And so that was, well, here you see people dumping barrels of beer into the sewer with some very depressed officials looking on. In my office, I actually have a photograph of the Texas state capitol in 1933 when Prohibition was finally lifted. There were trucks of Falstaff beer outside the Capitol, and these guys waiting for noon on that day when it became legal to drink again in the United States. They immediately rushed in and brought our legislators beer. In any case, it was something that lasted all throughout the 1920s and did have a significant impact on public morale. There were a series of anarchist mail bombings throughout the country in 1919, where people trying to disrupt the government and really having a number of vague and different political goals tried to terrorize the country by mailing bombs. During the summer, which became known as the Red Summer, there were race riots in 38 U.S. cities. There were a number of lynchings, there were murders, there were people burned at the stake, believe it or not. There was horrendous racial violence. There was also a Red Scare. During the Wilson administration, 14,000 left-wing advocates had been held without charge under the various acts that prohibited criticism of the government, criticism of the draft, criticism of the war effort, and so on. Some were deported and just exiled from the United States, but many remained in jail. There were strikes throughout the country. A large general strike in Seattle, a Boston telephone strike, a steel strike that affected Pittsburgh, Chicago, Cleveland, and a number of other cities heavily involved in steel production. And finally, in October, President Wilson himself had a stroke. And the country was largely leaderless after that. He was not killed, but he was incapacitated. And so the government was itself in a sort of bad state. Here are some images. I've already shown you the one of Prohibition. Here's another of police going into a bar and seizing the alcohol there. Notice the shifty eyes of those guys behind there. They're like, I know what's going to happen to these bottles. Here are some of the people, here's an effect of some of the anarchist bombings. In this case, automobiles that were destroyed. Or here, an office destroyed by the bombings. Here was a church being burned as part of the race riots that took place in the summer of 1919. Here are striking steelworkers in this case, I think. And then, of course, in popular culture, there was the Black Sox scandal. The 1919 World Series was the Chicago White Sox against the Cincinnati Reds. The White Sox were considered by far the greatest team in baseball. They were expected to win against the Reds handily. In fact, they lost 5-3. Back then you had to win 5 games to win a World Series. And there were a number of great players who really performed very badly in the series. It only emerged later, although there were rumors immediately that they had thrown the series, it only emerged in 1920 in court that indeed some of the key players on the White Sox had thrown the series, had received payments from gamblers in order to purposely lose. And so a number of the people on that team were permanently banned from baseball. And hence they're called the Black Sox instead of the White Sox. But it was sort of a shocking development in popular culture during the day. Well, there was an election in the fall of 1920. Warren Harding was elected president with over 60% of the vote. It was a landslide. In part, this was a reaction to the state of turmoil in the country. In part, due to the sense that Wilson had betrayed the country. He had promised to keep the United States out of the war, and then almost immediately upon re-election had sought to get us into the war. To some extent, it was due to the sense that the country was drifting and didn't have any real leadership. This was the first election in which women had the right to vote. Anyway, Harding was famous for his call for a return to normalcy. He said, America's present need is not heroics, but healing. Not nostrums, but normalcy. Not revolution, but restoration. Not surgery, but security. He was trying to restore a sense of national unity, national purpose, of harmony that had been lost as a result of the war and as a result of, well, a number of the changes that resulted from Wilson's progressivism, also to some extent that resulted from the economic turmoil at the end of the war when a lot of people returned only to find there were not jobs for them. Now, Harding inherited a severe recession. The country, as I've said, was in turmoil for a lot of different reasons, but also the economy was crashing after the end of the war. War production had kept the economy booming throughout the First World War, but when the war stopped, all of that came to a sudden end. And so unemployment shot up, and in general there was a sense that things were not going well. Harding did what almost no one has done since in reaction to an economic crisis. He did nothing. Okay, he said the right answer is simply not to interfere. So he practiced laissez-faire economics. Laissez-faire, the French for let it be. In other words, the government should really not intervene, should simply allow private agents to make private decisions about economic matters. He cut government spending by 40%. And as a result of all that, actually the economy boomed. The recession ended very rapidly, and the roaring 20s began. Now that's not all he did. He cut government spending. He began, and then Coolidge, his successor, much more dramatically reduced tax rates. But the result was an economic boom that lasted for the entire decade. He also freed political prisoners. He freed the thousands of left-wing people, socialists and others who had been imprisoned by the Wilson administration, and declared that the United States shouldn't have political prisoners. Things were going very well until the Teapot Dome scandal in 1923, when his Secretary of the Interior took $400,000. That would be the equivalent of, about $4 million today, to give people favorable leases on government property. Now, there was no allegation that Harding himself was involved in any way, but nevertheless, an aura of scandal arose around the administration, and not long after that, Harding himself died. Calvin Coolidge, his vice president, then became president, and he was re-elected in 1924. Coolidge was famous for declaring that the chief business of the American people is business. Economy, he said, is idealism in its most practical form. And he was famous as somebody who was taciturn, who said very little. He was from Vermont. He had been a farmer and then a judge. He was somebody who believed in minimalist government and himself in minimalist activity. He was one of our most intellectual presidents, actually. He read Latin and Greek. He had been a classics professor, but he was also capable of remarkable self-control. At one point he said, listen, most people who come to see the president are looking for something that they ought not to have. I find that if I just sit there and let them talk, after a while they stop, and then they go away. Okay? And so he was famous for saying very little. I don't know if it's a true story, but there's a story that circulated of a couple that was introduced to him at some kind of political event. And the man said, please, Mr. President, I have a bet with my wife. I bet that I could get you to say at least 3 words to us. His answer was, you lose. In any case, he did very little, said very little, but I don't want that to imply that he was simply a lazy president. He really believed the president's job was to establish a certain kind of rule of law and then leave things alone. In fact, there was a sort of philosophy of government underlying this. He thought that the government's role was to provide a framework within which people could seize opportunities, exercise freedom, and do whatever they wanted to do. Government activity, he was convinced, apart from constructing this framework and keeping peace upon it, was really likely to produce unforeseen negative consequences. So he was a major advocate of what some historians have called the law of unintended consequences. That basically is the idea that whenever you do something, the unintended consequences, the consequences you don't mean to happen and don't even foresee happening, those end up being much more important than the consequences that you do intend. He thought that was almost always the case with government activity, so he thought it was usually likely to produce more harm than good, so the best thing for government to do was simply back off and do nothing at all. Basically, build the highway, or the road, or the canal, or whatever, keep peace on the highway, but otherwise let people do whatever they wanted to do and not try to influence things. Now, he was convinced that government, if it did get involved, would distort the choices that people would otherwise make, lead them to make worse choices. And for that very philosophy, both Harding and Coolidge were later demonized by historians. Paul Johnson describes it this way: there was a systematic misrepresentation of public policy over a whole era, a systematic denial or distortion of the historical record. And indeed, the 1920s and 1930s are very controversial periods in American history, with one side politically saying the 1920s were wonderful and the 30s were awful because good policies were pursued in the 20s and bad policies in the 30s, as opposed to another school that says, no, bad policies were pursued in the 20s, that's what set up the terrible crises of the 1930s, and then good policies were pursued thereafter. In any event, there is a huge amount of historical disagreement about these presidents and about these policies. Yeah?
Yeah, Harding and Coolidge, they're always, in history books portrayed as being, kind of crappy presidents. Why is that, though? Because what you just showed us, they didn't seem bad. In their, I don't know, portrayed as being bad presidents. So.
Well, it's a good question, right? I mean, look at what happened during the 1920s. There was a rapid recovery from this recession at the end of World War I, and throughout the entire decade, really, things went very well. I think I will not show you today, I'll wait until later, an image of world health during World War I, where Rosling, who is describing all this, says, "What a catastrophe!" In a wonderful Swedish accent. But he's showing you how things throughout the 20th century, or throughout the 19th century actually, and the 20th century have improved, health has improved, wealth has improved throughout the world. And then you get to World War I and the Spanish flu epidemic, and there's this sudden drop of everything. But then it bounces back and resumes an even more rapid rise. So, given the crisis that the country faced at the end of World War I, it really is remarkable that things rebounded as quickly as they did. The country became prosperous, health and wealth both recovered dramatically. There was a very rapid bounce back, and I think they deserve a lot of the credit for the rapidity of the recovery. Now, here's what happened to taxes, and there really were tremendous transformations. There was no income tax in the United States before 1913. And in fact, you've got to realize that before the Wilson administration, almost nobody in the United States ever had any contact with the federal government. What did the federal government do? Well, it raised money through tariffs. So if you were importing goods or exporting goods, you had to deal with that. But otherwise, how would you, and if you were in the military, of course, But how else would you actually encounter agents of the federal government? How would you have any interaction with it at all? Basically, you didn't. Very few people had any interaction with the federal government before 1913. But then the income tax was passed. There was an amendment to allow it. Initially, it was at a very low rate. Most people paid nothing, or a rate of 1%, maybe 2%. If you were very wealthy, it went up to 7%. But it was a very low rate of taxation. Look what happened in 1917. All of a sudden, average people were paying 2 to 6 to 8%, and it went all the way up to 66% under Wilson. Then once we got involved in the war, it went up to 77% at the top rate, into the teens for average people. Then, after the war, it went down a little, but not much. The top rate went down to 73%. The average person was paying, somewhere between 4 and 12%, let's say. What Harding began, and then Coolidge continued, was a pattern of cutting these rates. So by 1924, the tax rate at the bottom was down to 2%, the top rate down to 46%. By later in the decade, the top rate was down to 25%, and the lower ranks just 1.5%. By 1929, just 0.5% at the bottom, and only 24% at the top. Now to take these numbers on income and make them contemporary, add a 0. So you can see there were actually a lot of different tax rates, a lot of different tax categories. So net income of about $20,000 would be that smallest category. A typical person might have an income between $4,000 and $6,000 at that time. That'd be like an income of $40,000 to $60,000 today. This top tax rate, which kicked in throughout most of the decade, sort of around $750,000, that would be equivalent to like $7.5 million today. So these are really for the very wealthy people. But you can see how taxes rose dramatically under Wilson, from being almost nominal to then being reduced dramatically later in the decade. Now what happened to unemployment? Well, it had gone up after the war to about 9%, but then it declined very rapidly to under 5%. And with a few little bumps, it stayed there until the crash of 1929, and actually into 1930 when the effects of that were felt. The labor force growth picked up and continued throughout the decade. Economic growth in general, things hit a low point in 1921, just around the time Harding took over, but then increased dramatically. And you can see real GNP per capita went up from, this would be, again, adjusting for inflation, around $48,000 in today's dollars, going up to, well, almost $60,000. So the average person actually got significantly richer during the decade. And the stock market reflected that too. You see here the crash in 1929, but we'll talk about that later. Well, in general, there's a sort of business cycle that had been in effect for a long time, but that was felt and that affects, crucially, how one thinks about this decade. But this is something that has happened in this economy and in most economies throughout history in pretty predictable ways. There's a period of expansion. The economy grows at a rate that's affected by all sorts of things, by population growth, by technological innovations, by government policies. Greater incomes and profits lead to an expansion of credit. In other words, people are willing to loan people more money because there are so many opportunities. That hits us kind of peak. And at some point, credit extends too far. People loan people money they really shouldn't be loaning money to. The economy at that point is in a state of what some people have called irrational exuberance. That's Alan Greenspan's term. And then it contracts. People can't pay their debts. And so the economy slows down and goes into a trough where it hits bottom and stagnates at a low level. I used to have to explain that. Now I don't have to explain that. But anyway, you can see how this pattern repeats itself. At some point, then the economy picks up and so on. It's a question to some extent of how big the expansion is, how rapidly things get out of this trough and resume expansion. But nobody's really found a way to tame human nature and stop this from happening. Now, mostly I want to talk about the social and intellectual changes of the 1920s. Andre Siegfried wrote a book in 1927 called America Comes of Age, to express an idea that was common in the 1920s, that finally the United States was an engine of prosperity, a center of culture, a center of civilization. Up to this point, America had felt sort of second fiddle to Europe. Finally, after the war, America felt as if, listen, Europe, we saved your butt. We showed you that we're stronger than you are, and in fact, we're now more prosperous than you are. We're actually the center of Western civilization and the center of culture. So Siegfried wrote, as a result of the revolutionary changes brought about by modern methods of production, the American people are now creating on a vast scale an entirely original social structure. What were some of the new technological developments of the 1920s? What does he mean by new methods of production?
Well, I mean, the car wasn't created, but it kept building and kept expanding.
Exactly. The car was in fact invented in the 1890s, but it was a sort of craft thing. What Henry Ford did in the 1920s is begin mass producing automobiles. Okay, so the modern methods of production, in other words, what we now consider mass production, factories, highly specialized tools and so on, he was able to greatly reduce the price of automobiles by producing the Model T and then the Model A Ford. There weren't many choices. He said, listen, you can have it in any color you want as long as it's black. But still, it made these things available to people in the middle classes. So all of a sudden, now think about the change that results when all of a sudden you can have a car. I don't have to explain this to you, you're teenagers. Okay? It's a tremendous change. Before that, you can only get as far as you can walk. Maybe you have a horse, if you're affluent enough, can actually ride somewhere. But all of a sudden you have a car, you can go places, you can control your own life in a way that people weren't able to up to this time. That sense of mobility, that sense of affluence, is something that's dramatically new. And it begins to change American culture. There's a new classlessness in dress, speech, and attitudes. As a result of radio, as a result of movies, as a result of travel. People can actually move around now and encounter people who aren't from their own neighborhood or their own city. Also, they can listen to the radio. The very first radio station in the United States was, anybody know? KDKA, Pittsburgh, 1921. Okay, one of the first things it broadcast was the 1921 World Series. And so, all of a sudden people were able to listen to other people on the radio. Now, that has transformed the United States dramatically. Today, almost any of you could speak in class, and I could not really tell where you're from. Okay, that was not true. Even when I was a child, there was another transformation due to the rise of television, but radio began that transformation. It was common in the United States of 1920, let's say, that people spoke so differently that outside of their own area, they could not be understood. There was a girl who moved to my high school, back in the 60s from Alabama, and I was then going to high school in Virginia. I could not understand a word she said. She was not intelligible to me. The way I grew up talking, actually, and the people around me grew up talking, probably would be unintelligible to you.
Can you still talk like that now?
Oh yeah.
Can you do it?
Sure, I'll do it. This is something my cousin actually said a while ago. When I started studying linguistics, she said this, and I remember thinking at the time, I bet very few people I now know would understand what she meant. Here's what she said. Jens going down the end of that? I'll say it again. Jens going down the end of that?
No idea what that means.
Okay, that in South Pittsburgh, that's perfectly normal speech. Okay, I learned to talk the way I talk now, and if I get sick enough, I start talking like that again. What did that even mean? Yeah, yins. That's the Pittsburgh form of y'all. Okay, going. Well, that's going. Down. That's down. Notice the verb to be has been left out. Are you going? Yeah, right? There's no are. In fact, when I studied Latin, the teacher made a big deal about how in Latin you can leave out the verb to be. It's not like English. And I thought, what do you mean? It's exactly like English. It was like the English I spoke. The end. That's to the end. Prepositions, they're little words. You leave them out. TH is hard to say. It slows you down. Don't say it. In New York, you substitute a duh. But no, in Pittsburgh, just leave it out altogether. It's just E, okay? So the end, that's to the end. And that's just, and that. So literally, it's y'all going down the end and that. And then you have to supply from the context what on earth that meant. Because an important rule in the dialect is never use an unnecessary word. And so it was like, oh, you have to know there's a park at the end of the street. And so down the end meant down to the end of the street where there's a park and that. In other words, are you going down to the street at the end of the park to engage in the activities associated with going to parks? So anyway, that's the sort of way that, but now you can understand that even I can still tell what part of Pittsburgh somebody's from by the way they pronounce various things. That's a sort of South Hills thing. In the North Hills, it's a different sort of thing. In the city, it's a different thing. I can tell what neighborhood people are from by just the way they speak. But a lot of that is getting erased now, and most people meeting me would not know where I'm from because we've learned all to speak in more or less the standard way. But that's because of radio, television, movies. All of that was something that really first began to have a significant impact in the 1920s. And notice that's why it became so important that silent movies ended. Silent movies, you don't know what the actress is saying, right? She might be saying, Yun Squantani and that. And so, really, it's only after there are talkies that movies have a big impact. Well, there's also a cultural liberation. Women can now not only vote, they're often in many cases working outside the home. We tend to think of the 1960s as a time when women started entering the workforce. Not really true. A lot of women began working outside the home in the 1920s. There was widespread education at this time, so that literacy rates rose to 96%. Expectations of education changed. Before this, getting an 8th grade education was a big deal. A lot of people dropped out after 6th grade if they got education at all. By the end of the 1920s, people routinely graduated from high school. It was a tremendous change. There was also a cultural flowering in literature, in the arts, and in music. F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, Lewis, Dos Passos, Dreiser, Faulkner, Woolf, O'Neill, Wilder, Berlin, Kern, Gershwin, Copeland. The list goes on and on. Many of the names you take to be characteristic of American theater or the American novel or American music, the Great American Songbook and so on, really date from these figures who were active in the 1920s. This also led to a sort of society of East Coast highbrows. In the education of Henry Adams, his own book about himself in 1918, he speaks about an educated disillusionment, a sense of national culture that was just beginning to emerge. He referred to it as the multiversity, as opposed to the university. The idea was it was a culture that took all sorts of American elements, all sorts of European elements, elements from other parts of the world, and combined them into one distinctive culture. It was producing an educated sort of disillusioned group that were ambivalent about America. Fenwick Brooks described it this way: never forget that it's we New Yorkers and New Englanders who have the monopoly of whatever oxygen there is on the American continent. And indeed, if you go to New York or New England, you find out people still view it that way. In fact, a few decades ago, there was a cover of the New Yorker that depicted this view of the world. 9th Avenue, 10th Avenue, the Hudson River, Jersey, Kansas City, Las Vegas, the Pacific Ocean, China, where, more than half the world is New York City. In fact, really just the west side of Manhattan. Anyway, yeah, there was a kind of East Coast cosmopolitanism that really began to arise, where New York and New England did think of themselves as the centers of American culture, looking down on the rest of the country, really. That became, well, at this point didn't become, but was in danger of becoming a kind of counterculture. Now, I'm going to skip ahead to Fitzgerald, since I've been delaying getting to him. The novel is actually quite a remarkable novel. It is the novel of a young man, much of it written at Princeton when he was a student, some written just afterwards. The parts you've read, in part written to try to lure back Zelda, whom he was in love with and had dumped him. It succeeded. When the novel actually was a success, Zelda took him back. And anyway, they were not really good for each other. As you can see, he only lived to be 44 years old. He sank further and further into alcoholism. She turned out to be a psychotic. But anyway, he had a short but glorious career. This Side of Paradise in 1920, The Beautiful and the Damned. 2 years later, The Great Gatsby, Tender as the Night, The Last Tycoon. He was, overnight really, a fabulously successful writer and an emblem of American culture. You can probably think of other people whose rapid and early success has sort of, well, ended up ruining their life. He was a bit like that. Now, this Side of Paradise is itself a coming-of-age novel. Amory Blaine is our hero. He goes to